More than half of the younger generations asked in a new poll said women's rights go too far and now result in discrimination against men. 52% of Generation Z and 53% of millennials say the promotion of women's rights is discriminating against men, according to a survey by Ipsos, UK and Global Institute for Women's Leaderships at King's College London. This contrasted to 40% of baby boomers and 46% of Generation X. So have women's rights gone too far, or have they not gone far enough? And why do so many young people seem to be holding this view? David Starkey, why do you think young people seem to be disillusioned with women's rights movements?
Well, maybe it could be called experience, dare I suggest, Calvin. Particularly the chaps find themselves mocked, perpetually accused of rape, of sexual license, of violence, of toxic masculinity, and so on and so on. So perhaps, oddly enough, they could think maybe things have gone a bit too far. Maybe there are problems. And you see, I think the great problem, Calvin, if we just lift ourselves out of that survey and do what you and I should be doing, which is go back and asking big questions. The real problem with the whole notion of female equality, like of every other kind of campaign for equality, is that it confronts the brutal fact of human difference. How do you have a notion of equality and somehow make it compatible with the fact that in most ordinary meanings of the word equal, people aren't equal? And I think this issue, as it were, looms particularly strongly because, of course, we're dealing with a 50-50, roughly, setting aside trans, which we're going to have to talk about, a 50-50 split within humanity. I think, again, it's very interesting that it's generationally different. That my generation, the baby boomer and whatever, that saw the initial parts of the process are on the whole still pretty relaxed about it. Once you're actually getting the full toxic measure, and particularly the intrusion of law into every aspect of intimate relationships. I mean, this is the other issue. So let's just go back and look at how you try and deal with this question of equality and difference. I mean, first of all, I think you and I would be perfectly happy with acknowledging from very different perspectives the fundamental differences between men and women, that they are enormous. They are biologically enormous. They, I think, are temperamentally enormous. We have different functions when it comes to the most fundamental business of reproduction. Now, early feminism, if you go back to the 18th, the 19th, and the early 20th century, early feminism was essentially about saying, or much of it was, that there really wasn't very much difference. This whole notion, as it develops, that the differences are socially conditioned, that really, okay, yes, men and women's bodies are different, but really their minds, their attitudes are fundamentally the same. In other words, you lie.
Well, this is it. As a Christian, I would say that men and women are equal in dignity and in worth, but very, very different in our roles in society, in family, in community. And that's important to recognise, as you stated. But the feminist movement seems to want equality to mean that they're the same. So is there a criteria on equality under the feminist movement, would you say?
Well, what I was trying to say, I was trying to reinforce what you said, because I think it's important that in a sense, one looks at the biblical texts. I mean, the Pauline texts on this are totally specific about the idea of what I think is called men and women being complementary to each other, complementarity rather than equality. In other words, recognizing that they've got different roles, but that the different roles are equally valuable. Whereas, of course, what feminism has tended to do is to deny that there are fundamentally different roles, and in a sense to say that both should have the same role, with, of course, extraordinary problems clashing up against that brute fact.
We have to come round to the trans movement, because surely the trans movement has had some impact on the feminist movement, whether it's combative or complementary. Where do you think it comes to play?
Well, what I think is clear, Calvin, is that in a sense, feminism has been bitten on the bottom by trans. If you actually look at how trans rights are presented in terms of their affiliation and the spectrum, the normal way in which you present it is to say trans rights are an extension of gay rights. Now, and whole role of Stonewall in this, Stonewall having lost any function, because basically equality over homosexuality is generally recognized. And if you actually look at opinion polls, if you look at this opinion poll, it's barely contentious now. So Stonewall had to find something to do, and it jumped on the trans bandwagon. But of course, gay rights were never about a denial of biology. On the contrary, I know I was one of the pioneers. I'm so ancient, way back in the early 1970s. I was one of the pioneers, and what we were calling for was a recognition of biology and a recognition of biological desires. So, in fact, trans derives directly from feminism, which is why, of course, people like Catherine Stock have been so beautifully caught. There's a wonderful essay by Douglas Murray, gloating, Douglas is very good at gloating disgracefully on the way that she's been caught between her later experiences and her early opinions, because her early opinions were completely about this business, that gender is merely socially constructed, that as it were, these things are independent of biology. Well, of course, the ultimate extremity of that is the notion of trans rights, in which what you say effectively is that you can perform an act of transubstantiation. I mean, this is what's going on in Scotland, forced Sturgeon's resignation. The fact that all a man needs to do is to say, I am a woman, and abracadabra, hocus pocus, hoc est corpus, you've suddenly become one. And I think this highlights the absolute absurdity of this. But perhaps we can move on from these high abstractions to practical consequences. I think one of the things which again, I think is one of the reasons why the opinion survey is as the opinion survey is, and the extraordinary feminization of politics, of society, of discourse. I mean, one of the reasons, I think that you can see, despite all the pretense that we had completely behind the Ukraine, you can actually see how utterly remote our politics are from theirs. I mean, you look at somebody like Zelensky, absolute toxic masculinity incorporated, works out, bulges everywhere. This passionate assertion of the vibrancy of fighting, of separate roles of men and women, and so on and so on and so on. We, of course, are a society in which war is fundamentally unthinkable. We have pared down our armed forces to the point at which they are ridiculous and they are absurd. Instead, we lavish money on welfare. We lavish money on a malfunctioning NHS. The whole of COVID was fundamentally feminist, the triumph of the precautionary principle against reason. And this seems to me something we really do need to recognize. One of the fundamental catastrophes with the NHS is the fact, and I'm going to say it and dare to say it, is that we now train more women as doctors than men. But 80% of them, by the time they're 35, want kids and want to go part-time, which means you're actually doubling the cost of medical training. And we're refusing to admit these facts, and again, I go back to my beginning. Facts do matter. You will remember the wonderful phrase of John Maynard Keynes: "When the facts change, I change my mind." Don't you? What's clear is this new generation is beginning to change its mind. It's beginning to see what the problems are.
And I do want to ask you about masculinity, but before I do, I want to challenge something you said about the trans movement coming from the feminist movement, because the TERFs, or the trans exclusionary radical feminists, would separate themselves entirely from, or be separated entirely from, the trans movement, and they do seem to butt heads quite a lot. So I'd like to delve into that a little bit.
What I was really trying to say is the logic of trans comes from radical feminism. I mean, what feminism has suddenly had to rediscover, and this is why people like me and Douglas Murray have been giggling quietly at Catherine Stock, is had to rediscover biology. It's had to rediscover biological difference. And you can see how painful this has been to very many feminists, because they've been in fundamental denial on this. You know, this desperate attempt at talking female sport up. It's just not, generally speaking, very interesting because of the different natures of our bodies. But the desperate attempt takes place. So that was what I'm really trying to say. I wasn't in any way denying that there's an absolute conflict. Of course there is. And indeed, I would go further, Calvin, and I would say that one of the problems, the moment you begin doctrines about rights, you inevitably legislate conflict.
Right.
The old notion of rights, which is, you know, going back to Locke and whatever, life, liberty and property, they apply to everybody. The moment you introduce sectional rights, women's rights, gay rights, trans rights, black rights, yellow rights, whatever you want, immediately then you have conflict, because one set of rights conflicts with another set of rights. And the answer is, of course, and rather it is not the answer, but what we resort to is perpetual legal intervention. And you legislate conflict. There's always been a war between the sexes. You know, go back to Greek drama, go back to Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew, and all the rest of it. There's always been a war of the sexes, but I think it's got more vicious. It's got more destructive. It's got more, I think, debasing. And again, you look at one of the reasons why we talk about toxic masculinity, the apparent rash of sexual violence especially within, but also without relationships. Outside relationships. But again, I think we need to ask some very serious questions. A, whether this really is the case, and B, if it is the case, why it should be the case. I mean, I think one of the great problems is, of course, that feminism redefined rape. Feminism determined that rape should not have any element of physical violence. It should be merely an issue of consent. Now, the problem is when two people are in bed together, who in the world is to determine what the levels of consent are? Unless, maybe we are getting to the point now where everybody will have to leave their mobiles switched on when they have converse to establish really, whether I've said I agree. And, when you get particularly excited, oh God, that hurts, stop, which very often, certainly in my own experience, can really be a little...
David, please.
Which is very useful being a gay man in that sense, because you have experience of, in one sense, both sides to an extent. But I think that these are genuine points. And for example, Denmark, that most people see as liberal paradise, but of course we're increasingly aware that it's not. It has unbelievably strict rules on immigration, very strict rules on assimilation, on speaking Danish. But Denmark has retained the notion that for the denial of consent to be clear, there should be an element of force, or that's one of the tests of it. And it's the problem when you completely mentalize crime. Again, you remove it from its physical context, and therefore you get this terrible, this awful business of you see between couples, and the ease with which a woman can destroy a man with such a claim. And there's another thing too that, again, being a historian, having grown up in a substantially different world, even within my own lifetime, I am aware that there used to be ways in which the physical difference, the difference of strength and whatever, was socially controlled. Now, everybody who is young is going to laugh in my face when I say there was a thing called chivalry. The notion that you treated, if you're a man, you treated a woman differently.
Yeah.
I would have been disgraced if as a boy or a young man, I had not held a door open for a woman, if I had not got up to offer my seat to her, if I had not performed all sorts of formal acts of courtesy. And this seems to me to really matter. Again, nowadays, the idea of a man going down on his knees to ask a woman to marry him is seen simply as a sort of bit like wearing a buttonhole or a white dress at a wedding. It actually had a profound meaning. If you look in the whole notion of courtly love, the whole idea of, in other words, the invention of love as opposed to simply sexual desire or marriage for property or profit or whatever. If you look at it, it's wonderfully described right at the beginning of the process by Geoffrey Chaucer, who's really the inventor of England and English as concepts. Chaucer says that a man is lord in marriage, but servant in love. And there's this extraordinary, again, this complementarity of the roles, the absolute necessity of consent. In the same way, of course, the doctrine of marriage, what actually marries you, as I understand it, and still is the case, is not actually the ritual in church. It is simply the mutual rendering of consent. Will you take this man to be your husband? Will you take this woman to be your wife? And you say yes. And it's that consent that makes it. But of course, it's again, the whole meaning of husband and wife is going back to Paul. It's so fundamentally different. And again with gay marriage, I mean, Calvin, I don't know what your feelings on this are. I'm a gay man. I shudder every time a man describes another man as his husband. It's like a sticky patch. Something feels wrong.
Well, I won't get into that conversation because I've spoken too much about gay marriage as it is. But on the issue that you just raised of, for example, men used to take a knee to propose. Now we see women taking a knee to propose to the man. The feminist movement, you could say, has persuaded women that they are men, and that's the route to equality, that women become men. And it's the same with chivalry that you mentioned. Chivalry has been weaponized now, that if a man is chivalrous towards a woman, it's perceived that he's looking down upon her somehow, therefore it's not seen as favorable, and men can be chastised for it. So that's a couple of examples, but I want to get your thoughts on how do you think men have suffered because of this?
Yeah. First time I was shouted at by a woman for holding a door open for her. Yeah. I mean, it just seems to me to be an act of gross ill manners. Yeah. And it's very like, I would say, to be truthful, the reaction of the Muslim recently who refused to shake hands with the Princess of Wales. It is simply, it's a deliberate insult. And it's far too much of this, as I said, it's been weaponized. Again, we need to go further, of course. It is the catastrophic consequences for many men, particularly those who were less intellectual, those who are more physical, which used to be regarded as traditional male virtues. And male strength is properly considered a virtue, and it's still very necessary, as we'll find out if Mr. Putin continues his behavior in the fashion that it is now. But these things are held in contempt and they are actively discouraged. And this seems to me to be profoundly, desperately dangerous. The whole notion that if a boy behaves as a boy, he is misbehaving because he's not behaving like a girl, because he's not conformist, because he's not, so-called emotional intelligence, because he's not primarily verbal. I mean, as a boy, I hated physical. Let me put my cards on the table. Boy, I hated physical sport. I was wildly over-verbal. I had deep.
I can't imagine that.
Emotional intelligence. But many boys don't. Probably the bulk of boys don't. And it just seems to me, to be so preposterous that we refuse to recognize, or indeed that there are subjects that girls prefer and that boys prefer. It will be just bearing in mind the huge differences in our biology, what all my friends who are scientists in this area tell me, is correspondingly vast differences in our brains. Because, of course, our brains are controlled by all the other secretions and whatever in our bodies to a very significant extent. It would be astonishing. And this pretense that we are the same.
What you've just mentioned is probably the reason that people still perceive the idea of a gender pay gap, because men are attracted to certain roles, women are attracted to certain roles. We know that if a man and a woman are both in the same role, they will be paid the same amount. So there is no gender pay gap in the true sense. It's just that men and women are different in different ways. Which brings me to the patriarchy, because some women would suggest, or some feminists would suggest, that women's rights haven't gone far enough because the patriarchy still exists. And of course, that's based on the presumption that the patriarchy is a bad thing. So the question, David, is, does the patriarchy still exist? And is it a bad thing?
I think in almost all areas that we're looking at, I mean, if by patriarchy we mean roughly existing structures of society, it seems to me they are dissolving even as we are talking. I mean, it would be astonishing if they weren't, under the impact of sustained attack, which is what there's been. Again, this seems to me to be profoundly destructive. Now, I am by no means I am not a reaction, let me be quite clear. I am not a reactionary conservative. I believe absolutely with Disraeli that particularly a society like Britain is a naturally progressive society. But the important thing is that change is progressive, that it builds on what is there before and adapts and alters it subtly. What we've done is something completely the opposite of that. It's been a willful act of social revolution, and it's been as dangerous and as destructive and as devastating as all revolutions. We really do need to understand this. Britain escaped political revolution in the 20th century. It had one of the most radical of social revolutions, which is one of the reasons that we see, the consequences, the abandonment of wedlock by more than half of society. The thing that should be completely shocking, Calvin, is the way in which wedlock is now associated with education and prosperity. In other words, the institution which is most, you would see it religiously, I would see it socially, the institution which has most beneficially shaped the Western way of child rearing, most beneficially handled and accommodated this difference, this complementarity that we're talking about, is now in absolute headlong retreat. And we wonder why there are the problems in child rearing. We wonder why there are so many children, as school teachers now tell us, starting school who were basically not simply not able to read and write, but not able properly to go to the toilet, keep themselves clean, sit still. There's this shocking social dysfunction that's resulted from a social revolution. And I'm afraid undiluted, raw feminism is the fundamental aspect of this. It really is time, not that we turn the clock back, but that we thought about what we've done and where we've gone wrong.
I think you've just solved it. David Starkey, thank you very much.